I want you to picture a specific moment, just frozen in time. The date is September 12th, 1683, and you're inside the walls of Vienna. The situation is, it's beyond desperate. For 2 solid months, the city has just been suffocating under this massive siege. The air is thick with smoke, with decay.
Right.
The defenders are completely exhausted. They're starving. We're talking about literally boiling shoe leather and eating stray dogs just to survive one more day.
It's a bend of the line.
It is. And when they look out from the ramparts at this just endless Ottoman army, it doesn't feel like a military defeat is coming. It feels like the lights are about to go out on an entire civilization.
Yeah.
But then the ground starts to shake, and I mean that literally. On the Kahlenberg Mountain, high above the city, the largest cavalry charge in human history begins to thunder down the slopes.
Incredible.
And leading this charge are the Polish winged hussars. These are men wearing massive feathered wings on their backs that make this terrifying clattering sound as they ride.
An incredible image.
They hit the enemy line with the force of an earthquake.
Right.
The siege is shattered in a matter of hours.
Wow.
Now, what's so fascinating here isn't just the battle tactics. It's the motivation. We live in an age that tells us walls are evil, that openness is, the highest moral good.
Right, that borders are a problem.
Exactly. But you look at that charge and you realize those men weren't fighting out of hatred for what was in front of them. They were fighting out of a fierce, protective love for what was behind them.
For the city.
For the city, for the culture, for everything. They were the ultimate gatekeepers. And that distinction between a wall built on hate and a wall built on love, that's exactly what we seem to have forgotten. And it's exactly what we need to get into today.
That moment, that historical snapshot, it just perfectly captures this defensive impulse. And like you said, it's not rooted in aggression. It's rooted in a protective love for an inheritance. And for this deep dive, we're looking at material that explores what happens when that protective love, that sense of belonging, that oikophilia is, when it's pathologized, when it gets turned completely on its head.
So we're talking about a kind of systematic self-hatred, an intellectual and cultural phenomenon that some analysts argue is directly linked to civilizational decline.
That's the core thesis.
Okay, so let's unpack this with some of the specific vocabulary from the source material. We should probably start with the concept you just mentioned, but it's opposite. Oikophobia.
Right, so oikophilia is the love of home. The term oikophobia was coined by the late British philosopher Roger Scruton, and it's a really powerful diagnostic tool for understanding the modern political landscape.
Okay, so break that down for us. Oikos.
Oikos is the ancient Greek word for home, or, household, community. It's your place.
Right, so if xenophobia is the hatred of the foreign, the other.
Then oikophobia is the hatred of the familiar. It's the fear or hatred of home, of one's own society or civilization. It's an intellectual disease that turns inward.
It's entirely internal.
Entirely. And Scruton's definition was very specific. He called it the felt need to denigrate the customs, culture, and institutions that are identifiably ours.
A felt need. That sounds less like a reasoned position and more like a compulsion.
It is a compulsion, a selective cynicism. And what's really crucial here is the context in which this thing emerges and really starts to gain traction.
Which is?
In a lot of the historical sources, this kind of self-hatred really takes hold when a great power is perceived to be in decline. It functions almost like an autoimmune disease.
An autoimmune disease? How so?
Well, the body's defenses, its immune system, starts to turn on itself once the external threat seems manageable, or maybe more importantly, when its internal confidence starts to wane.
That's a fascinating link. So decline and self-hatred are sort of two sides of the same coin. They feed each other.
They seem to. And analysts point to this happening before. There's a widespread manifestation of it in England after World War II.
Right, when the empire was clearly dissolving.
Exactly. The British Empire was dissolving. Its global power was receding. And the sources describe this distinct intellectual mood where the grand achievements of the past were suddenly being reframed.
Not as triumphs, but as crimes.
As crimes, as things to be ashamed of. And a lot of observers, a lot of analysts feel the United States is going through a very similar phase right now.
A great power grappling with deep internal divisions, a sense of maybe declining exceptionalism.
And all of that leads to this intensification of internal cultural self-contempt.
And this isn't just some abstract political philosophy. It shows up in daily life in these sort of moral performances, especially among people who are about to become the gatekeepers of the next generation, our future elites.
Absolutely. The material has this really illuminating anecdote about a graduate student.
Yes, tell us about that. It perfectly captures this pathologized self-critique.
It really does. So here's this highly intelligent, quick-witted student of ancient history, and she asserts very confidently that she possesses the moral authority to criticize only her own culture.
Only her own. So in her case, Austrian or European history.
Right. But, and this is the key part, she felt entirely prohibited from criticizing any other culture. It was a complete taboo. It's this incredibly selective form of moral posturing.
So what happened when she was pushed on that? For instance, what if a non-European wanted to criticize, say, the historical atrocities of Nazism?
Well, she really struggled. She couldn't articulate a coherent justification. She just kept insisting on the intense moral obligation she felt to denounce her own inheritance, only her own.
So what does a mechanism like that reveal? What's going on under the surface?
It reveals a kind of moral self-flagellation that's, well, it's intellectually and morally asymmetrical. It's not about seeking universal truth or justice.
No.
It's about demonstrating your own distance, your presumed superiority to your own cultural inheritance. The only acceptable target for any kind of vilification is yourself or your own cultural group.
Which creates this really sterile intellectual posture. You can't judge anyone outside the group, but you have to just intensely denounce everything within it.
Right. And this impulse, it moves very quickly from the academic seminar room into, real institutional life. It starts trying to erase symbols of history that don't meet this impossible present-day moral standard.
The San Francisco School Board incident is a perfect example of this.
It really is. The decision to remove that mural of George Washington from a public school because of its supposed racism, it illustrates this principle of relentless negativity, but targeted only at Western figures.
Yeah, the argument isn't just that Washington was a flawed person. I mean, that's true for basically everyone in history.
Of course. The argument is that the symbol itself must be erased. It has to be physically removed because it failed to meet a 21st century ideological purity test. This is an active manifestation of that oikophobic instinct. It's a rejection of the inheritance itself.
And the sources document the most extreme end of this moral self-blame. There's the story of the American volunteer teacher in Africa after 9/11, who claimed the United States deserved the terrorist attacks because of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, that goes so far beyond critique. That suggests a desire for self-punishment on a colossal scale.
It does. And analysts who study this phenomenon argue that this kind of total moral reversal views the West, and particularly the United States, as not just flawed, but as fundamentally evil, as something that warrants existential retribution.
It's a huge psychological shift. It replaces any kind of complex historical analysis, one that recognizes progress and Republican virtues alongside failures.
And it replaces it with this simplistic narrative of perpetual guilt and deserved punishment.
So it sounds like this cultural self-hatred, it provides a really powerful vehicle for a new ideological movement. The sources connect this directly to the vacuum left by the failure of those big 20th century utopian systems.
That's precisely the connection that's drawn. When the great utopian economic experiment, Marxist socialism, collapsed with the Soviet Union, the energy and the faith that sustained those movements, it didn't just vanish.
It had to go somewhere.
It needed a new focus, a new source of faith to conserve that revolutionary fervor. And since the economic engine of pure collectivism had so clearly failed, the targets had to shift.
So the focus moves away from dismantling capitalism as an economic structure and towards dismantling Western tradition as a cultural structure.
Correct. The analysis in the sources is that the newest iterations of this movement, they sought to justify their continued devotion by expressing what's described as an uncompromising hatred of tradition.
But they quickly realized that in a multicultural world, you can only really safely vilify one tradition.
One tradition, the West. And so the narrative shifts completely. The history of the United States gets defined not by its foundational documents or its innovations or its long, hard progress towards civil rights,
but only by its original sins: slavery, racial discrimination. And those are framed as perpetual, unreformed characteristics.
Yes, as the very essence of the thing, which allows for this continuous state of moral indignation. It feeds a deep psychological need for scapegoating.
So if traditional external scapegoats, other groups, are politically unacceptable,
then the target has to become internal. This is identified in the material as the core psychological driver. Humans often derive a kind of satisfaction from directing frustration or aggression outward at a perceived villain.
Sure.
But if modern liberal society has established that it's ideologically unacceptable to scapegoat other ethnic or racial groups, then the only direction left to safely channel that aggression is inward, at your own group.
So by scapegoating your own group, you get the psychological release of hatred, but you get to mask it as moral virtue.
You've nailed it.
It's the ultimate way to feel both powerful and righteous at the same time.
Exactly. The logic is that by actively denouncing the traditions and structures that define their own culture, these individuals feel virtuous. They feel morally superior. They're aligning themselves on the side of making things better,
while indulging in what is, at its root, a form of hatred against their own cultural inheritance.
And analysts describe this self-hatred as the intersectional glue that binds this new movement together. It unites all these otherwise disparate utopian goals by focusing them all against one common vilified enemy, Western tradition.
So the sources make a pretty strong case that this self-hatred is systemic, it's intellectual. So if oikophobia is the fuel, we really need to understand the complex ideological engine that converts this self-hatred into institutional action.
Right.
We're talking about critical theory.
We are. We're talking about what many commentators frame as the siege of the mind. The sources identify the primary engine for this cultural nihilism and deconstruction as critical theory, or CT.
And it's different from traditional social sciences, which, they aim to just describe and understand society.
Very different. Critical theory explicitly exists to analyze, to challenge, and crucially, to transform systemic power relations.
So it's not just an analytical framework. It is, from the ground up, a political project.
It is, absolutely. Its explicit goal is societal transformation through what they call praxis.
Praxis.
Which is the combination of theory with political and social action. So the theory positions itself as both an academic framework and a direct movement for social change. That's a crucial distinction. It doesn't ask, what is society?
It asks, how can we change society?
Exactly. And it does that by focusing on the dynamics between dominant and oppressed groups.
And to do that, to establish the grounds for that transformation, it first has to dismantle the existing structure of knowledge itself, right?
It has to. It does that by challenging the very notion of pure objectivity and rationality. CT argues that what a society accepts as knowledge or truth isn't neutral at all.
It's shaped by power.
It's fundamentally shaped by power dynamics and the social context of who is producing that knowledge. So if an idea or an institution or a concept, even one related to science or objective standards, if it benefits the dominant group, the critical theorist assumes that idea must be suspect.
Because it's inherently shaped by the power structure it's trying to maintain.
Correct.
So, to take a concrete example, if the institution of science or the tradition of classical literature was created primarily by, say, white Western men,
then the standards of excellence those institutions uphold are automatically deemed to be tools of oppression, regardless of their actual content.
That's the logical outcome.
That is the logical outcome of applying this critique. And this approach, it traces its history back to the Frankfurt School in the 1920s. Thinkers like Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse.
Right. And they were trying to figure out why the working class wasn't universally rising up in revolution like Marx had predicted.
Exactly. They realized that the traditional Marxist economic critiques just weren't sufficient to explain that, so they needed to incorporate cultural factors into their analysis.
So they started looking beyond pure economics.
Way beyond. They significantly expanded classic Marxist analysis, incorporating psychology, specifically Freudian psychoanalytic theories and cultural critique. They adapted Marxian concepts like reification and alienation, but they applied them to consciousness and mass culture, not just to labor.
So their critique was focused on how culture itself was kind of industrializing and pacifying the masses, preventing a true revolutionary awareness.
That's it. But that was just the first generation. The movement evolved and expanded pretty dramatically after that.
Right. There was a second phase?
There was. You have thinkers like Jürgen Habermas, who focused more on communication and the possibility of a rational, emancipated discourse. But the most significant shift, for modern applications anyway, came from the post-structuralist thinkers.
Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida.
The big two. They're often interwoven into contemporary CT, and their contributions were, well, they were transformative.
So can you specify how Foucault and Derrida really contributed to this modern deconstructive toolkit?
Okay, so Foucault's work on genealogy and what he called power knowledge was critical. He argued that power doesn't just repress people, it actually produces knowledge. It produces categories and truth.
So things we take for granted, like sanity or criminality.
Or even sexuality. He showed that these aren't objective realities. They are historically contingent constructions used to manage and control populations.
And Derrida's
deconstruction focused on language. He demonstrated that concepts and binaries like good-evil, male-female are fundamentally unstable and hierarchical. And that provides a kind of blueprint for dismantling existing texts, laws, institutions by showing their internal contradictions.
So critical theory moved from criticizing economic structures to critiquing mass culture to eventually critiquing language, rationality, and truth itself.
It became the ultimate philosophical solvent.
And that solvent has, as the sources suggest, metastasized into nearly every corner of the academy.
It really has. Modern critical theory has moved almost entirely away from economic analysis to become this broad cultural critique. It underpins movements that analyze power structures in everything from law to science.
So things like critical race theory, critical legal studies,
critical pedagogy, intersectionality, the list goes on. But the foundational aim remains the same. Analyze how dominant groups and systems control society through exploitation and then demand transformation.
So given that complexity, all that dense theory, how does it actually translate into institutional critique on the ground? What people today would popularly call the woke mindset.
It manifests as an ideology that's focused almost entirely on symbolic warfare.
Not material struggle.
No, not at all. Analysts define woke as the ruling ideology of the modern professional elite. These are highly educated, high-status individuals, and they leverage this theoretical framework to focus intensely on symbols, rhetoric, language, and cultural wars.
So if the stated goal is social justice, how do the sources reconcile this intense focus on symbols and language with the continued lack of progress on on the bread and butter material struggles like poverty or wealth inequality?
That is the central critique that analysts raise. They argue that the focus on cultural and symbolic issues like language use, representation in media, historical statues, that it acts as a powerful diversion.
A diversion from the complex, intractable, and financially costly problems of material inequality.
Precisely. And the primary tool becomes social shaming, or what we now call cancel culture.
And that's where that phrase, impact not intent, becomes the mechanism for complete ideological control.
Exactly. It weaponizes the concept of harm. So take the example of Joe Rogan, or really any public figure who uses language that falls outside the ever-shifting bounds of what's acceptable.
Right. And they try to offer context or argue for their genuine intent. They say, I didn't mean to be insensitive.
And the response from activists who are influenced by this theory is immediate and total impact, not intent.
The implication being that the speaker's own self-assessment, their history, their original meaning, it's all completely nullified.
It's relevant. The interpretation of the observer, particularly an observer identifying as or claiming to speak for the oppressed, holds exclusive epistemic authority.
It grants absolute authority to subjective feeling. The moment someone claims to feel harmed or unsafe by something that was said,
the objective facts of the speaker's context become irrelevant. And this is a highly effective social shaming mechanism because it provides an intellectually sanctioned pathway to take anything someone says out of context, interpret it in the most damaging way possible, and then use that interpretation to destroy that person's professional credibility or position.
So we have the ideological engine, which is critical theory, and we have the fuel, which is oikophobia. The next logical question is, who are the drivers? If the goal is to champion the marginalized, why do the loudest voices so often belong to the highly privileged?
This is where the sociological analysis in the source material becomes absolutely crucial. It reframes this wokeness not as a genuine movement for emancipation, but as a highly sophisticated tool for elite class reproduction.
So we're talking about high-status groups signaling virtue to solidify their own social and professional position.
That's the argument. The sources refer to these individuals as symbolic capitalists. And we should probably delve into that specific term because it draws on the work of sociologists like Bourdieu and Kahn, and it's key to understanding the mechanism.
Okay, symbolic capitalists, what does that mean exactly?
The concept is rooted in Pierre Bourdieu's analysis of capital. He talked about cultural capital, things like knowledge, skills, credentials, and symbolic capital, which is prestige, honor, and recognition.
Right.
So symbolic capitalists are the contemporary elite. They're journalists, academics, artists, lawyers, tech professionals, HR managers.
People who generate their status and power not by owning factories, but by controlling the discourse.
Exactly. They produce, manage, and legitimize the dominant cultural discourses within what's called the symbolic economy. They control the narrative, the language of morality, and the rules of institutional engagement.
And the central critique here is the hypocrisy.
A massive hypocrisy. These elites aggressively promote radical egalitarian claims and social justice discourse, while often maintaining highly exclusionary and exploitative lifestyles themselves.
Living in these hyper-affluent, unequal urban centers.
Right. And the discourse functions primarily as a high-status signal for their peers, rather than a genuine pathway to material change for marginalized groups. It's a mechanism for domination, not emancipation.
So the focus on cultural issues isn't an accident, it's strategic. It lets them use the language of social justice while distracting from their own very significant economic privilege.
Absolutely. Symbolic capitalists fetishize cultural politics, the debates over rhetoric, representation, identity, at the explicit expense of class politics. The bread and butter material struggles that impact the poor and the working class.
And this focus is profoundly advantageous for them.
Of course it is. It actively shifts public attention away from the structural economic inequalities from which they disproportionately benefit.
So it allows them to live in the most expensive, economically segregated zip codes in the country, places like the Northeast Corridor, the West Coast, while at the same time railing against systemic inequality. They're just deflecting attention from the financial mechanisms that sustain their own status.
And they use identity politics to facilitate this deflection. The sources call this process manipulative victimization.
Manipulative victimization.
Yeah. Despite being highly educated, affluent, and disproportionately from white backgrounds, these elites use their control over symbolic resources language, media platforms, to claim victimhood. And they do this by identifying strongly with genuinely marginalized groups.
The poor, ethnic minorities, LGBTQ people.
Exactly. They effectively borrow the moral authority of suffering without ever having to experience the material hardship.
That's a powerful idea.
The sources even introduce a specialized concept for this, totemic capitalism. This describes a claimed or perceived membership or identification with historically marginalized groups, which is then explicitly used to enhance an individual's status and mobility within that elite sphere. It becomes a resource.
A resource that can be leveraged for professional advancement. Can you give a more detailed example of how this totemic capital is actually operationalized in the professional world?
Sure. Think about the hiring process within an elite institution, a nonprofit, a university, a major media outlet. When they're assessing candidates, traditional cultural capital, like a degree from an Ivy League school, is necessary, but it's not sufficient anymore.
Symbolic capital requires something more.
It does. So if a candidate, despite their elite background, can persuasively frame their work or their identity or their personal history as aligning with a traditionally marginalized group or cause, that identification becomes a unique, monetizable asset.
It signals their moral purity and ideological conformity.
Right. And it enhances their mobility over equally qualified peers who just happen to lack that totemic resource.
The irony is just profound. In their relentless pursuit of these anti-capitalist, anti-privilege movements, they're simultaneously integrating and commodifying that very critique, turning it into a status marker for their own ideological reproduction.
And their behavior outside of the discourse just confirms this manipulative dynamic. The sources provide a lot of empirical evidence of highly selective altruism among these symbolic capitalists.
They're clustered in these highly unequal urban regions.
Yes, and their charitable giving patterns reveal a stark set of priorities.
So they talk about inequality constantly, but do they actually donate to relieve poverty?
Very rarely. They display a remarkably low rate of charitable donations towards causes that are directly focused on poverty alleviation or reducing material inequality.
So where does the money go?
They overwhelmingly prefer causes like environmental protection, animal rights, or, and this is crucial, donating to prestigious cultural institutions.
Like elite universities, art museums, major symphonies.
Precisely, which means they funnel their resources right back into the very institutions that validate their symbolic capital and reproduce their class status.
It's a completely closed system.
It is. And furthermore, the sources argue that the universalizing narrative of privilege, like the flat assertion that all white people are privileged, serves a critical function for these elites. It obscures the unique material benefits that the upper-class elites draw from the existing structure.
How does it do that?
By flattening class differences. It makes it acceptable to marginalize, for instance, the white working poor, because they supposedly benefit from racial privilege. And this shifts the entire spotlight away from the elite's substantial economic power and focuses it squarely on symbolic grievances.
So this suggests that the entire edifice of this cultural critique, rather than being a force for radical egalitarianism, is actually a really successful systemic account of institutional dominance by the symbolic elite.
That is the hard-hitting conclusion of this critique.
They're not rebels. They are the new ruling class.
They are. And they have successfully disguised ideological control as emancipation. And the price of their success is the dissolution of the internal walls and standards of the very institutions they now dominate.
And that brings us to the core consequence of applying this ideological solvent to institutional standards. If the gatekeepers are now selecting based on this symbolic capital rather than objective criteria, what happens to the intellectual integrity of the institutions themselves?
Yeah.
Let's start with the university.
The sources call this the liquefaction of the university. See, critical theory's aim is to politicize and relativize foundational concepts like rationality, objectivity, and merit. When that philosophy becomes the spirit of the university, its internal standards of excellence must necessarily dissolve.
There's that powerful anecdote in the material of the elderly literature professor at a historic university. He saw himself as a classical gatekeeper. His job was to stand at the door of the literary canon and just demand intellectual rigor.
Right. And he observed that the institution wasn't destroyed by some frontal assault. He termed it an acidic solvent.
An acidic solvent.
He watched as rigorous standards of debate just dissolved, and they were replaced by claims of emotional safety, by concerns about making individuals feel uncomfortable. The very idea of objective literary quality or historical truth was increasingly labeled a tool of oppression wielded by the dominant group.
So the distinction between excellence and mediocrity, which is the very thing a gatekeeper is supposed to protect, it just disappears.
It vanished. And he concluded that the university, without its intellectual gates, it just ceased to be a place of higher learning. It transformed into what he called a soup of affirmation.
A soup of affirmation.
Where the primary goal became emotional validation rather than the pursuit of truth or intellectual rigor. When critique of ideas is replaced by fear of causing offense, the university loses its entire core function.
And this erosion of intellectual gatekeeping, it inevitably cascades into professional competence, which moves the consequences from the theoretical realm into the physical world. The structural engineer's experience is frankly alarming in this regard.
That anecdote is absolutely critical because it connects the cultural shift to the hard reality of physics and professional responsibility. The engineer described this growing sense of anomie within his junior team.
Anomie. So as defined by Durkheim, that's a state of normlessness.
It's a state of normlessness where social boundaries and regulatory standards just shatter, leaving individuals disconnected from established professional values.
So how did that normlessness manifest in a critical field like structural engineering?
Well, the engineer recounted this situation where a new hire made a fundamental critical calculation error, a big one.
Okay.
And when the engineer, performing his professional duty, corrected the error, the junior team member didn't respond with professional shame or a sense of responsibility for the mistake.
The response was purely emotional.
Purely. They felt unsafe and attacked. The professional boundary, the non-negotiable requirement for objective competence in a field where lives literally depend on accuracy, it just shattered. The individual's subjective feeling of being criticized completely overrode the objective demand of the profession.
So they interpreted the correction of a professional error as a personal, moral transgression against them.
That's it. And this demonstrates the immense danger of eroding the gatekeeping function of competence. If the culture insists that you are perfect just as you are, then the drive for the rigorous self-improvement required for professional excellence just disappears.
The engineer's observation was so profound. He said, gravity does not care about your feelings.
It doesn't. In fields built on objective reality, you can't argue with a failing calculation. Incompetence has real destructive consequences. And this anecdote, it just highlights a societal shift toward a kind of cultural narcissism where the professional sphere is increasingly expected to cater to the psychological comfort of the individual rather than the objective reality of the task at hand.
And the sources link this culture of self-absorption and this erosion of personal responsibility directly to the rise of the therapeutic state, which provides the cultural and political architecture for this shift.
Yes. We have to look closely at Thomas Szasz' lifelong critique of what he called the therapeutic state. This pervasive and, he would argue, unhealthy alliance between medicine and government that seeks to manage human behavior through pseudoscientific means.
So Szasz argued that this system expands the domain of mental illness far beyond objective biological disease,
to encompass a myriad of human sins and foibles. And in doing so, it erodes individual responsibility.
So instead of being held morally or professionally accountable for a failure, for being lazy or irresponsible or just performing poorly, that failing gets relabeled as a medical or psychological disorder that requires intervention.
That's the mechanism. Szasz posited that mental illnesses are whatever psychiatrists empowered by the state say they are. And since there are no objective biological signs for most claimed mental disorders, unlike a broken leg or cancer, the criteria can be infinitely expanded.
Right.
Szasz pointed out that the diagnostic domain has metastasized to include everything from gambling, smoking, shoplifting, political extremism, to just simply being unhappy or sad. By medicalizing human imperfection, the state gains an enormous new domain of control.
And this has profound implications for legal and moral concepts like freedom and coercion. If my bad behavior is a disease, then I'm not responsible for it. I'm a victim of it.
And that fundamentally alters the social contract. Szasz highlighted the ultimate incoherence and really abuse of the system in cases like the commitment of sexually violent predators.
How so?
While the legal system convicts and imprisons these individuals based on the premise that they could have restrained themselves, that they were morally responsible for their actions.
Right. But then what happens after they complete their sentence?
After they serve their time, the very same state then commits them to mental hospitals based on the exact opposite premise, that they now suffer from irresistible urges or a psychological disorder that makes them too dangerous to be released.
That's completely incoherent. It's a cynical manipulation.
It is. The therapeutic state uses this quasi-medical pseudoscientific justification to retroactively enhance sentences. It's dressing up a violation of due process in the language of medical necessity and care.
So it's the fusion of government and morality, allowing the state to police behavior by medicalizing it. It fundamentally undermines the idea of the autonomous, responsible individual who is required to uphold the objective standards of their profession, their community, and their inheritance.
And this profound shift in moral architecture, it stands in stark contrast to the classical wisdom that informed past civilizations. When we see the relentless campaign to tear down all the figures, all the symbols and achievements of the past, we are participating in what G.K. Chesterton famously diagnosed as the ultimate arrogance.
Chesterton viewed this erasure as silencing the wisdom of countless generations because we think our own fleeting moral standards somehow supersede theirs. He called tradition the democracy of the dead.
Yeah, beautiful phrase. And he argued that tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. To refuse to listen to their accumulated wisdom, their successes, their failures, it means submitting to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about right now.
And so this modern oikophobia, driven by the symbolic elites and rationalized by critical theory, is therefore this aggressive, arrogant rejection of the very inheritance, the institutional resilience, the intellectual rigor, the concept of personal responsibility that produced the wealth, freedom, and competency we are now so rapidly dissolving.
That's the argument.
The gatekeepers of Vienna, those winged hussars, they understood that their fight was not for some transient political aim, but for a continuity, a deep, protective love for the home that stretched back through the centuries. But the paradox of our modern civilization is that by striving for infinite openness and by dissolving the distinction between excellence and mediocrity in the name of emotional safety and symbolic equality, we risk losing the very thing that made our civilization capable of producing freedom, competency, and wealth in the first place, leaving us in a wasteland where gravity, competence, and history still apply, regardless of our feelings about them.